Senator Kennedy, face the nation. From Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you're about to see Democratic presidential candidate Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts face the nation in a spontaneous and unrehearsed interview with veteran correspondents from the nation's press. Peter Lissagar, chief of the National Bureau of the Chicago Daily News, Blair Clark of CBS News, and William H. Lawrence of the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. And now here's the moderator of Face the Nation, CBS News correspondent Stuart Novins.
Here in Wisconsin, Tuesday's primary election will determine to which candidate the state's 31 delegate votes will go at the Los Angeles Democratic Convention. It will be the first real test of the relative strength of Senators Kennedy and Humphrey. Senator Humphrey has already appeared before our panel, and now Senator John Kennedy of Massachusetts is here to face the nation. Senator, we want to get right into the questions, so if you will, let's start with this first one from Mr. Lawrence.
Senator, for several weeks now, you and Senator Humphrey have been beating the bushes and chasing the voters of Wisconsin all over. I think most observers think that for one of you to get a victory, you'll have to get a majority of the popular vote and a majority of the delegates. Now that you've looked the situation over and the campaign's almost finished, candidly, just how do you think you will do?
Well, I'm hopeful, but I wouldn't make any prediction. I think that it's very difficult to make a judgment on a state like Wisconsin. I'm hopeful we're going to win.
Senator, how would you define a victory? What are your terms for a victory for you here?
Well, I think Mr. Lawrence has described it, to get certainly a majority of the popular vote. The delegates, of course, you could get a majority or a minority, regardless of the popular vote, the way the congressional districts are arranged. But I would hope, I think, for any kind of a victory, you'd have to get a majority of the delegates, too.
Senator, one of the charges that Senator Humphrey has been making about your campaign is that it was a very expensive one. And I'd like to quote him. He calls it the most highly financed, the most plush, the most extravagant in the history of politics in the Middle West. Have you been spending money extravagantly in this campaign?
I certainly haven't, Mr. Lissagar. We made a financial report on what we had expended, which was $72,000, and which included our radio and TV and our literature that we had. Now, before we're finished, we're going to we'll have a larger figure than that, because that, of course, was up to the week before the election. We've had TV since then, and it will go higher than that. But I must say that there is no evidence for that very extraordinary charge. We have our TV and radio time is easily ascertainable, and it's about the same as Senator Humphrey's. We've made a distribution of literature, a lot of it by hand by volunteers, some of it in the rural areas by mail, and that's very determined. We had no billboards, so that I think you can make a determination about where money went, and I think that our campaign is in accordance with that of Senator Humphrey. My judgment is that we will expend about the same amount.
Do your figures, Senator, account for money that comes in from the outside? And as much as I understand, you have to report only on what you spend.
Well, the law in Wisconsin is extremely vague. For example, in the reporting of a few days ago, Senator Humphrey reported only $500 expended for radio, TV, and none for billboards. Well, now, we all know that there are billboards, and there's been quite a lot of time hired on radio and TV by Senator Humphrey, as there has been by me, but he reported none of it because he is not compelled, in fact, really to almost report anything. The Wisconsin law is not very precise, and therefore there's really no direction as to what you must report or not report.
When you make a final tabulation, Senator, will you include such things as transportation?
Yes, within the state. Yes, within the state. That's correct.
Senator, I had heard the estimate that a primary campaign in any state cost about $250,000. I believe you agreed with that figure at one point.
Well, it depends on the size of the state. I would say in a state like Wisconsin that it would probably run $135,000 to $40,000. That's my judgment about what the campaign would probably run in total, including every conceivable expense that you might have. It might run that high. Now, if you hire a half hour or 15 minutes of statewide TV, it costs you approximately $5,000. If you hire a spot, cost you 10 seconds or so, might cost you $200. I must say, gentlemen, TV is not very inexpensive. Newspaper advertising is not inexpensive. Billboards, nor is mailing inexpensive. If you have a million homes in the state and you try to cover it by mail, of course, that costs money. I think you should realize, however, that the Brookings Institute states that President Eisenhower's campaign in 1952, when costs were lower, was $2,500,000. Taft, it said, exceeded that. And Governor Stevenson's in 1956, according to Brookings, cost more than $1,500,000. It is unfortunate that campaigns cost some money, but I must say that I think ours is in a reasonable expenditure, which is easily ascertainable. You can tell exactly what we've spent it on, and we're going to report it.
Senator, another charge that has arisen in this campaign by Senator Humphrey's campaign manager is a junior...
Well, a good many charges have arisen.
Well, this seems fairly important, is
Yes.
the junior family have made effective and subtle use of the religious issue.
Well, now, by what means, Mr. Littmore, can you imagine anything more ridiculous, really, than that charge, that I would attempt to make use of religion? Now, I think that that is an extraordinary charge that Mr. Heaney made and Mr. Ivan Nestigan, our chairman. There was no evidence produced. What is the evidence for that?
Senator, I'd like to ask you as a question to follow out of that, whether you think...
Yeah, but I regard that as a very serious political charge. I was surprised when it was made, and I'd like to know in what way it's so.
Do you think there's a Catholic voting bloc in the state of Wisconsin?
No, I think I've stated on many occasions that I hope that no one would vote for me because I was a Catholic or against me for I was a Catholic. There are a great many serious issues facing the United States. Where I went to church this morning, Sunday, seemed to be really important only to me. And I would hope that with all the matters that face the United States, and that we would certainly be able to discuss all those questions which go to the survival of this country without really worrying about my religion. The Constitution took care of all this matter most satisfactorily. The First Amendment on the separation of church and state, Article 6, which says there shall be no religious test for office. That's what I believe. And that, in my opinion, is what the majority of the citizens of Wisconsin believe.
Would you agree, though, Senator, that politicians look at it a little differently, and we'll be looking at this Wisconsin election to see how well you do in the non-Catholic areas of the state?
Well, I have no doubt that people will be studying this election and analyzing it as they have already. But I think that the citizens of this country vote for a candidate, I hope, on the candidate's competence. That's been my experience in 14 years in politics. Until it's proven wrong, it is my experience now. Now, I've entered the West Virginia primary. The West Virginia has the lowest percentage of Catholics in the United States, 3%. Now, if I felt that there was a massive anti-Catholic vote, do you think I would have entered West Virginia?
Well, have you encountered, so far as you're concerned, Senator, any suggestions that there is an attempt to whip up anti-Catholic sentiment in one form or another?
Well, there was an advertisement placed in the state by a very mysterious source. Nobody quite knows who produced the money for the ad. Somebody came up from Florida to place it, paid for it in cash. Senator Humphrey certainly had nothing to do with it. I know that.
There
So
was
that, but except for that, I must say that in this state, I've really found very little of that.
Senator, there is another point that in which religion is raised. There was an incident in Dijon the other day where the elected mayor of the village, who was himself a canon, was directed by his ecclesiastical superiors not to receive Mr. Khrushchev. This raises the question of whether such a thing could happen here.
Well, now, Mr. Lawrence, I make two exceptions to that. In the first place, this man, as I understood it, was a member of the clergy. Was he not?
I believe that is correct.
Well, therefore, he was subject to some disciplines, like all clergy are, that the citizen is not, number one. Secondly, it happened in a country abroad. Thirdly, General de Gaulle is himself a Catholic who's been meeting with Khrushchev very steadily, so of course it doesn't apply to citizens, and I would not permit it to. I would not accept any directions from anyone in regard to my constitutional oath of office, whether I'm a congressman, senator, or president. In other words, no instruction like that would ever be given in this country. No instruction like that would be obeyed. I want to make that very precise.
Senator, you've said in the past that you've attached a great deal of importance to the results here in Wisconsin. In fact, I believe you've indicated that if you did very badly, you might reconsider the whole
That's
business.
right. In my opinion, if I'm not successful here, I don't think that my chance of being nominated would be very good.
Well, my question is, why attach so much importance to a primary, especially in view of the history of Wisconsin, which is very eccentric on the presidency?
Well, I'm not sure I'd accept that description, but I will, because I have chosen to run for the presidency through the primary route. I submit my candidacy in places like New Hampshire, Wisconsin, West Virginia, Maryland, and so on. If I cannot demonstrate that I have popular support, then I don't think I ought to be nominated. Now, I know it's a hazardous way, and it may not make complete sense to do it just this way, but I must say it's far better than the other way, which is to have the candidates chosen just by political leaders. Now, there are some people who want to be nominated who are candidates. Senator Simonkins announced his candidacy, but he is not running in any primaries.
Isn't it true, Senator, that one reason for this route was that you felt, as a Catholic, with the history of the Al Smith campaign, that you needed to demonstrate your vote-getting strength in order to convince the convention?
That's right. I must say that if you didn't have primaries, I don't think I could run. The Al Smith experience holds heavy over politicians, and they forget that Governor Landon, who's a Protestant, was defeated in 1936 and got only 2 states, but nobody then suggests that that should govern, but the Smith experience does govern. He was defeated, and therefore they feel that it might be difficult for a Catholic because people might vote against him because of his religion. I'm hoping by running in these primaries to demonstrate that that is not a valid concern. And if I can't win them, then of course I wouldn't be nominated.
Senator Kennedy, a group of Senator Symington's supporters in this state, a Milwaukee group, have come out urging the voters to vote for Senator Humphrey. And your campaign manager, I believe, has called this bad taste or dirty pool or something like that. Do you share his opinion?
Well, I don't use the adjective. I just say that it doesn't seem to me that the people of Wisconsin are going to be very impressed by advice from a group, from a candidate who himself would not enter the primary and run. Senator Symington has run in no primaries. And as a matter of fact, Mr. Lissagore, as you know, no president of the United States has been elected who hasn't run in primaries of one party or another. Now, his group, therefore, advised that I should be defeated. It seems to me if Senator Symington had run, we would get a fairer test. I'm sorry he didn't. Therefore, I feel that the people of Wisconsin will make a judgment between Mr. Humphrey and myself and not pay much attention to outside advice.
Do you regard this action, though, as a Stop Kennedy action?
Well, I think it certainly isn't wish me well.
Senator, one of the odd things about the Wisconsin primary laws is the ability of Republican voters to cross over onto the Democratic side. On the basis of your surveys, have you any indication of how large a percentage of Republicans will be voting?
What people sometimes don't realize about the Wisconsin law is that there are no registered Republicans or Democrats in the state.
Yes.
In other words, when you talk about a Republican voting in a Democratic primary or a Democrat voting in a Republican primary, what do you base it on? There's no registration. It isn't like a state where you are registered as a Republican, registered as a Democrat, and then you vote. What we're talking about, really, in my judgment, are independents who may vote for me, or may vote for Mr. Nixon, or may vote for Mr. Humphrey. But I don't think that you say, unless you made a determination of whether they had always voted for the Republican ticket and then now were voting for me, I must say I think the crossover is overemphasized because of this reason.
So on the basis of your...
but I haven't got any information about it because my judgment is that the people, there's a great mass of independents in this state, as there are in my own state of Massachusetts. They will vote either for Mr. Nixon, Mr. Humphrey, or myself.
Senator, you've traveled far and wide across the state. What have you found to be the issues in this state? What are people concerned about? What are they worried about?
Well, I would say domestically, of course, is the drop in dairy income, which is 15% in 1 year, which makes it a terribly important problem to this state and really the United States, because these dairy farmers are an important market, and they are having, and that kind of a drop is catastrophic. So that's the number one problem. Then there's a great interest in the so-called, in the Farran bill, which provides medical payments out of Social Security funds, in strengthening the education system. Then, beyond that, there are other conservation and so on, but then I think there's great interest in foreign policy. Cuba, the state of our defense, our relations with Russia.
Senator, I've heard it said in Wisconsin that you have been moved to the left by having to deal with the Humphrey campaign. What's your answer to that?
No, I hope I'm in the same general trend that I've been for a great many years. I haven't moved to the left.
You don't think you've changed your position on any issues since you've been campaigning here?
No, I've been campaigning here for 3 months. We haven't had any issue. That's not I don't think there's any evidence for that. My view is the same as it's been for a good many months and years. I hope I can learn. I think primary is the most valuable experience in the world. It's the best education. But I don't really know where my position is particularly shift. I must say I've been educated on some problems about which I hadn't known very much. So
Senator, to move outside of Wisconsin for a bit, if I may, as a serious candidate for the nomination and approaching the convention now, do you approve of the plan of Paul Butler and others to bar from the floor Southern delegations whose electors for president are unpledged, uninstructed, not bound to support the candidate of the Democratic Party?
Well, in the first place, I hope that the southern states do not adopt the independent elector. That would mean that the candidate who might be nominated for the Democratic Party or the candidate for the Republican Party would run in November. And then the electors, regardless of whether the state went Democratic or not, could then vote for whom they want. A third party, the Republican candidate, even if the Democrats had carried the Senate. So I'm against that because that's really against the democratic process. Now, as to whether they should be seated, it seems to me that we ought to make a judgment based really on who the delegation is. For example, in the state of Alabama, there will be a contest between two slates. The delegates who come to the convention may be what might be known as loyalist Democrats, in other words, for having the electors responsible to the will of the people. But in the same primary, they might have chosen to have independent electors. Now, should you deny the delegation from Alabama the right to sit on the floor, even though they are anxious that the party have party responsibility? I think you'd have to make a better judgment after you've seen the trend in the South in the next 2 months.
Well, Senator, we have, besides Alabama, we have 5 other states that have adopted the free independent elector rule. Assuming that those delegations were not friendly to the National Party, any one of them or all of them, would you favor seating such?
Well, I think the delegates should indicate. It seems to me, regardless of what you think as a person about the Democratic Party or its candidate, that you should not deny the majority of the voters the right to be able to pick the candidate that they want. And therefore, I think we have a right to expect that the delegations from these states will support the concept of responsible electors. And I must say that would be my position, and I'd use my influence.
And if they do not support responsible electors,
we'll
you would not seat them.
No, we'll make a judgment on that, Mr. Lawrence, except I do feel very strongly that the elector, after all, the Electoral College is a sort of an anachronism from the Constitution. To permit those electors to vote for a candidate who wasn't even on the ballot, I would say, would be a real departure from democratic process. I'd be greatly opposed to it, and therefore I would be very concerned about delegates coming who are planning to have their electors completely independent of the result in the state in November.
Well, Senator,
now, what we should do about it and how it should be handled, I think we can know better in June and July, but at least there's my general sentiment.
But what will happen between now and June and July that will change the situation? The problem is an obvious one. What's the answer? Why do you wait till June?
I think we should make it extremely clear, Mr. Novins. I hope I've made my position clear, that we should make it extremely clear that we want the delegates to do their best to come to the convention to see that the electors are responsible. That's my view of what we ought to try to do.
Senator,
the best way of doing it, we'd have to, that's what to make a determination on, but at least my view is that the electors should be responsible for the majority vote. Now, the best way of effecting that, I think, is the question.
do you think the civil rights measure that appears about to come out of the Congress will be an adequate one for either you or any other Democrat to run on this fall?
Well, I hope it certainly provides for strength in voting, and I think if it does that, that will be an improvement. There are other civil rights which are in question, which I think the bill could contain, which I hope it would before it's finished, and for which I would support.
Getting back to Wisconsin for a minute, Senator. Senator Humphrey has challenged you many times to a debate here. What is your reason for not accepting the challenge?
Well, I saw the television. In the first place, I think Senator Humphrey and I have a general agreement on what the problems are facing the country and what the United States ought to do about them. We're members of the same party, and I think we generally agree on at least the major questions. I did happen to see in 1956 Governor Stevenson and Mr. Kefauver, Senator Kefauver in Florida, on a half-hour television debate. And what you did was have complete agreement, and finally it ended up with a rather picayune analysis of each other's record, which I thought was just destructive to them both and certainly didn't advance the public interest. I've discussed everything. I appear on television today and answer any questions. Senator Humphrey does the same. We're appearing both together on a television program tonight. I must say I'm trying to give my views as fully as we can, but I'm not going to attempt to get an attack on Senator Humphrey's record merely to make a debating point.
Senator, while campaigning here, you've seemed to have supported a great many of the Eisenhower administration's foreign policies.
Well, if I did that, Mr. Lissago, no, I've supported him on 2 points. One is Cuba, which I agree with. Secondly is the concept of going to the summit, and on the policy so far towards Berlin. I disagree with the policy towards Latin America, Africa, and Asia.
Now, how about the nuclear test ban approach? Haven't you agreed with this?
Yes, I do agree with the nuclear test. Of course, the Soviet Union put the plan forward, and I agreed with the administration's determination to go ahead on negotiating because I do think it's most hopeful. I've never thought we ought to make points about foreign policy. I disagree very much with some of their policy. For example, we've only had 100 people working on the field of disarmament for the last 5 years in government. We only have them today. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's been quite difficult. But I do agree with them on Berlin. I do agree with their decision to go ahead nuclear. I do agree with them on Cuba. I have other disagreements.
Well, the disagreements you mentioned were rather broad ones. Africa, Asia, I think you said, and Latin America.
Well, they're broad, but I'll be delighted to detail them. I don't think they've supported the Development Loan Fund. I think the President's trips, while beneficial, have not been supported by affirmative action since he's been home. I think India is moving into a serious economic situation. The United States has failed to mobilize, for example, the Western European countries or our own resources to assist them. We have ignored Latin America.
May I ask you one more specific question in this connection? If you were president next January, would you continue an agreed moratorium on small underground tests, which is a part of this president's
Yes,
proposal?
I wrote the president to that effect a few days ago.
You did write to him?
Yes, that's right.
Senator Kennedy, I'm a little curious. You said a moment ago that you thought you were in general agreement with Senator Humphrey on most issues, that you were
Well,
both
I think
from the same party.
on these matters which you just discussed, I do think so.
Well, then, what will this Wisconsin primary decide? Is this a personality contest?
Well, personality isn't quite the word I would use, Mr. Nolan. If you mean by personality which candidate has the most attractive manner or smile, what we're talking about is the presidency of the United States, which has great responsibility. He names all members of the courts. He names all members of the regulatory agencies. He can veto acts of Congress. He can negotiate with Mr. Khrushchev. And I would say that judgment, competence, sense of responsibility, emotional balance and stability, all of these things go into picking a president. We're not picking a congressman or a senator. And these are the matters about which, because there'll be many new problems which Senator Humphrey and I haven't even discussed because they've not even appeared on the horizon that the next president must address himself to. So I would say the key is really these qualities in picking a president.
In other words, this primary election will really not be decided on the basis of issues.
Well, Mr. Nowens, I don't know of a more important issue than the one we've been talking about. It is not when you choose members from the same party who are generally in the same political stream. For example, on nuclear test ban, on defense, on the underdeveloped world and so on. Senator Humphrey and I agree. There's nothing particularly remarkable about that. We're both members of the Democratic Party. We're both liberals. What I think is at issue is the most important point, which is the ability of a man to hold the most important office in the free world, what his judgment is. All these questions, I think that's the big question that we have to decide in picking a president.
Senator Humphrey has said, though, in connection with the business of not speaking on the issues or not debating him or not talking about the record, that Wisconsin voters, I quote him, won't be satisfied with being bit players in a Hollywood spectacular. What do you say to the charge that you constantly hear that the receptions in Sinatra and Hollywood is not the answer to the way you campaign?
I agree with you. It isn't the answer, but Mr. Lissigo, I hope every time I've spoken, and I've averaged about 10 speeches a day, I speak on an issue during my speech, and then I have a question period and give my views on any question the audience wants to ask me. Now, you can just use all the descriptive adjectives in attacking an opponent, and I haven't criticized Senator Humphrey in any way because I have a high regard for him before this campaign started. I'm going to end up that way. And I don't care really what phrases are used to attack me or criticize me. What is its substance is, it seems to me, our views on all questions. I'm delighted to answer them today, and I have, to every audience I've addressed, I've had a question period. I don't know what more I can do to discuss my position.
Senator, I'm very interested in the fact that you wrote the President a letter the other day about this nuclear test ban. Was this a voluntary act on your part, or is the President perhaps canvassing?
No, it was voluntary act.
Entirely voluntary.
That's correct.
Do you know
and you offered him your views with the idea that it would assist him in making up his mind?
Well, I thought at least if he was concerned about that, at least I agree, I'm still a long way from being the president, but I am one of the candidates.
That's what I meant.
And I thought that it might be useful to him to at least have my view on it as one of the many candidates.
Are you aware of whether your other rivals for the Democratic nomination might have done the same thing?
They may have. I haven't discussed it with them.
Because it might be useful to the president, even at this stage, if he had a kind of bipartisan agreement.
I'm sure
he couldn't name the next president,
I'm sure,
or this group.
From knowing Senator Humphrey's view on the matter, that if he hasn't, he has stated his view that in support of the negotiating with the Russians. So I'm positive if he hasn't written, he has indicated his view, and I don't know about the others.
Senator, one more question on that point. Would you recommend to the other candidates that they do the same as you have done?
Well, I think they should make their decisions. but I think it would be valuable, at least, that the president would be completely free to go ahead without any regard to the problem of binding his successor.
Senator, we've been talking so far as if there wasn't a third name on the ballot besides yours and Mr. Humphrey's, and that is Mr. Nixon's electors. I notice, or at least so I've been told, that you have not specifically attacked Nixon and that Senator Humphrey has. I wonder why you have acted that way and how you think Nixon will come out of the vote on Tuesday as a candidate.
Well, I've criticized what I consider to be administrative inadequacies in the last years. I've never attacked people personally, and I'm not attacking Mr. Nixon personally. What I'm talking about, a difference of opinion on positions. Farran bill and all the rest, aid to education, all these questions which are important. I've discussed those in detail. And I've been critical of those places where I think the administration's been wrong.
Do you see any partisan politics in the inclusion of Mr. Nixon in the Camp David talks with the British Prime Minister and the exclusion of the Democrats? Some have suggested this is a build-up for the Vice President.
Well, I think the Vice President has been built up by administrative decision, but I must say it's not, I don't find it unnatural.
And you don't particularly object in the case of
providing
campaign?
it doesn't interfere, I think that there's some disadvantages Mr. Nixon's going to have running on the position. For example, the decision of the administration to oppose the Farran bill, to oppose medical assistance for those over 65, that's a heavy load for Mr. Nixon to carry. I don't object to him getting some benefits because he's going to have to run on the whole record. So that's all right.
Senator, a quick question or a request for a prediction. Where would you say the votes in Wisconsin that used to go to Senator McCarthy will go on Tuesday?
I don't know. I suppose they'll be distributed through the candidates. I have no idea.
Senator, another quick question. In the event that you don't win in Wisconsin, do you have a second-choice candidate for the Democratic
right now,
nomination?
Mr. Lissago, I haven't really regarded that prospect. I haven't a second choice yet.
Senator, do you think any Democratic candidate can lick a Nixon-Rockefeller ticket?
Well, any candidate, Nixon-Rockefeller, I haven't put that ticket together yet. I would say any candidate nominated by the Democratic Convention who is willing to conduct a vigorous campaign can win, yes.
Do you accept it as an accomplished fact at this point that Vice President Nixon will be the Republican candidate this fall?
I've regarded it as almost inevitable.
Where do you think he's most vulnerable in terms of campaigning?
Well, I think Mr. Nixon is vulnerable in making a judgment as to who should be the best man to lead the free world at a very dangerous time.
Well, Senator Kennedy, thank you very much indeed for coming here to face the nation. Thanks also to today's news correspondents, Peter Lissagore of the Chicago Daily News, Blair Clark of CBS News, William H. Lawrence of the New York Times. This is Stuart Novins. There will be no Face the Nation program next week. We invite you to join us on April 17th, when our guest will be another Democratic candidate for the presidential nomination, Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri. Our program today originated in the station of WITI Television, Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Face the Nation was produced by Michael J. Marlowe. Associated in production, Ben Flynn and Norman Gowen. Directed by Bill Linden. Today you saw Democratic presidential candidate Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts face the nation. Al Walker speaking. This has been a public affairs presentation of CBS News.